When the news first came out about the Super League, there was an immediate negative reaction from many. For more on that, CGTN's Rochelle Akufo spoke to football journalist Karl Matchett.
The reaction was quite fierce and very, very quick. The supporters, broadcasters who were covering the matches that night, Gary Neville was very, very outspoken about it during a match he was actually commentating on, which involved Manchester United, one of the clubs involved from the Premier League. And it built very quickly from that. I think there were multiple reasons why supporters were very disappointed with it. One being, of course, it was almost landlocking the competitive edge. The Premier League wouldn't have mattered anymore in terms of the top four as it is at the moment to get into the Champions League. These 6 clubs from England would have automatically had their place guaranteed, no matter if they finish, as Arsenal are this season, somewhere in mid-table. So that was one part of it. It would have vastly reduced the possibilities for a team like West Ham, who are 5th at the moment, for example, to get into the elite competition. Also, there was a lot of anger, of course, that this would have further widened the financial gap between the haves and the have-nots in the Premier League and further beyond as well. In the Premier League, there is at least an element of sort of financial fair play, and where the clubs do distribute the broadcast revenue equally from the domestic income part of it at least, but that's not the same over in Spain. There's already a huge gap between Real Madrid, Barcelona and the rest of the clubs. That would have even been worse going forward if this were to have happened.
So then as all this came out then, how did the clubs react to the backlash?
At first, with not a lot, to be honest. The silence was the most deafening aspect of this. And I think that in turn made a lot of supporters and a lot of other clubs who were not involved very, very angry as well. There were a couple of matches Liverpool played on the Monday night, and the manager, Jurgen Klopp, who obviously had nothing to do with the decision-making process, was basically left to field answers from the broadcasters, from the media in general, and not an awful lot he could say. He'd only received the information roughly around the same time as the rest of us. And that was the same when Mikel Arteta was taking Arsenal for a game as well. Ole Gunnar Solskjaer, the match that I mentioned that Gary Neville was broadcasting on, he was asked about it before it had even been officially announced. So the managers were left to face the questioning without really having any detail themselves. Most of the clubs who were not involved, you had people like Real Betis in Spain, Everton in the Premier League in England, calling it all sorts of things, a scandal, an abomination of a selfish display from the top clubs, that sort of thing. Widespread anger was definitely the case, a feeling of greed pervading through the top tier of European football, and it's hard to argue against them given some of the statements that we've seen since.
So then what do you think this whole experience and some of the lessons learned, what does this mean then for reforms going forward or any sort of other efforts to form sort of alternative leagues?
Well, already we've heard talk that, for example, the Premier League are going to, or maybe even have by now, ratified a new rule which will suggest that if a team tries to go to another league in future, they will be immediately expelled. Whether that will actually be enforceable in its entirety remains to be seen, or whether it will simply mean that the legislation of a future new league gets around it with a particular type of wording and suggesting that it's not really going to be something that they have to leave, for example. There was never really any plan for Liverpool, Manchester United and so on to leave the Premier League as such, but it's besides the point, really. They didn't want them to be not using that competition to qualify for the next one. On the other hand, in Spain, Real Madrid, Florentino Perez, the president, says that this agreement that they have is binding and the Super League will still be able to go ahead in some form. It's just on standby at the moment. There is a lot of opposition to this, and naturally that will make any kind of discussions to bring it up again in future very, very difficult. There will immediately be a backlash, just people thinking, we're not just waiting until you decide that things have died down enough, there's not enough of an uproar about it. This will keep happening, especially with the fans in England. They feel that this is a power play from those clubs, and they've tried to seize the power back, of course, the supporters with their protests outside the stadium and so on. So it's not going to be easy to start up any kind of discussions again, but there will be knock-on effects, no question about it. Whether it is the Champions League reforms, which were eventually released by UEFA, still have another perhaps discussion over them. Maybe there will be another element of financial redistribution, perhaps, as a result of this. There will be knock-on effects. It's inevitable that somewhere along the way, the top clubs will get what they wanted, which was more of a say, more protection for their positions in the top competitions, more finances, of course. That's what it usually boils down to.